Okay, God and Evil by William Rowe. As a topic in philosophy, the problem of evil is generally considered to be the problem of trying to reconcile the existence of God with the fact that our world contains so much horrendous evil. Evil that very often appears to us to be randomly distributed without any rhyme or reason. Of course, if God is limited in power, intelligence, or goodness, the problem of reconciling his existence with the evil in our world is not so difficult. Okay, that is, if God is not all-powerful or all-knowing or perfectly good, then maybe we can explain why there is so much horrendous evil in the world. If he's not all-powerful, then maybe he can't prevent some evils. If he's not all-knowing, then maybe he doesn't know how to prevent some evils. If he's not perfectly good, then maybe he doesn't have any objection to the amount of horrendous evil in the world. So maybe that would be a solution. Of course, even if he's pretty powerful and pretty knowing, then you might think he could still prevent much of the evil in our world, but that's one possible solution. However, it is only if we think of God as the all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good creator that the incredible amount of horrendous evil in our world creates a serious problem for us. Okay, but although not thinking of God in this way might be a solution, most of us, I suspect, do think of God in that way. After all, that is the chief way in which God has been thought of in the three major religions of the West: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And if we do so think of God, one way the evil in our world may be a serious problem for us is that it may lead us to question whether there really is such a being as God. We may reason that if there were such a being as God, an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good creator, then there would likely be a good deal less evil in the world than there is. For evil is something that in itself is bad, so unless God had some very good reason to permit it, being perfectly good, all-powerful, and all-knowing, he would prevent it. Of course, with some thought, we can imagine reasons that God might have for permitting some evil to occur in his creation, but it is hard to imagine what good reasons he could possibly have for permitting as much horrendous evil as there is. Okay, let me also just right now show you. So on page 3, Rowe has these two examples of horrendous evils. A fawn is horribly burned in a forest fire caused by lightning. It lies on the forest floor suffering terribly for 5 days before death relieves its suffering. And then second, a 5-year-old girl is brutally beaten, raped, and strangled in Flint, Michigan on New Year's Eve a few years ago. Okay, and then also, as a lot of people do in these discussions, later in this article he mentions the Holocaust and Hitler. So the point is, while we can imagine reasons that God might have for permitting some evil to occur in his creation, so of course there are evils that seem to have a silver lining or seem ultimately to have some benefits. What we're really concerned about in this discussion of the problem of evil are those evils that don't seem to have a silver lining. Horrendous evils that, as Rose said on the previous page, don't seem to have any rhyme or reason to them. Okay, but it is hard to imagine what good reasons God could possibly have for permitting as much horrendous evil as there is. Indeed, when we think about it, we may conclude that there are no good reasons such a being would have for permitting all the seemingly pointless evil in our world. It is this problem that I want to discuss. Let's begin thinking about this problem by considering a simple argument from the existence of some evils in our world to the non-existence of God. Okay, so here we have an argument, 2 premises, and the conclusion is, therefore, God does not exist. And, to my ear, it's a little more natural to read the second premise first. An all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good being would not permit an evil unless he had a good reason to permit it. And then there exist evils that an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good being would have no good reason to permit. Okay, but whichever order you read the premises in doesn't matter. This is the argument, and you also, in the reading guide, both of these are the same argument. Here we just have God instead of an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good being. So God would not permit an evil unless he had a good reason to permit it. There exists evils that God would have no good reason to permit. Therefore, God does not exist. Or we can write it this way, which, if you remember, is modus tollens. So if God exists, then there will not be pointless evil and suffering in the world. Premise 2, there is pointless evil and suffering in the world. Therefore, God does not exist. Okay, so this is modus tollens, and it's modus tollens is always deductively valid. This version of the argument and this one are also deductively valid. So that means if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. So everyone agrees that the argument's valid. The question is, are the premises in fact true? So we're really asking, is the argument sound? Okay, let's say a theist is anyone who believes that God exists, where God is understood to be the all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good creator of the world. Now, if a theist is to reject this simple argument for the non-existence of God, she must either reject the first premise or the second premise. Most theists accept the second premise, as do non-theists. So theists, those who believe that God exists and is all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good. And then anyone who, whether or not they think that God exists, doesn't think that he has these qualities. So all those people, so basically everyone, agrees that premise 2, this premise right here, is true. An all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good being would not permit an evil unless he had a good reason to permit it. Okay, so then what it comes down to, most theists must reject the first premise, holding instead that God has a good reason for permitting each and every evil that exists. But what would be a good reason for God to permit some evil he could prevent? Since an evil is something that by its very nature is bad, God's good reason for permitting it would have to be something else. Either some outweighing good that, all things considered, he wishes to realize and cannot realize without permitting that evil, or some equal or worse evil that, all things considered, he wishes to prevent and cannot prevent without permitting that evil. Okay, so just to review, an outweighing good is either some good event that God wants to bring about, but which he cannot bring about without allowing the evil to occur. And the good event outweighs the evil one. Okay, so that good that outweighs the evil is an outweighing good. Or just a second scenario, there is some other evil that God wants to prevent, but he can't prevent it without allowing the evil in question to occur. And the evil that he prevents is equal to or greater than the one that he allows to happen. Okay, and then and the question we must ask ourselves is whether it is rational for us to believe that all the terrible evils that occur daily in our world are like that. Is it rational to believe that each evil is such that were an all-powerful, all-knowing being to prevent it, he would have to forfeit some outweighing good? Okay, that is it rational to believe that each and every evil is such that if God prevented that evil from happening, he would have to, at the same time, give up some outweighing good? Okay, and also, actually, while we're on the topic of outweighing goods, in the reading guide, you have this explanation here and this example. So you might want to look at that. Okay, but back to here. Is it rational to believe that each evil is such that were God to prevent it, he would have to give up some outweighing good? Perhaps it will make the issue before us a bit more concrete if we focus on some concrete examples of terrible evils rather than just terrible evils in the abstract. Okay, these are the two examples we already looked at. But again, it's not just so the fawn dies, but it's not just that it dies, it also suffers terribly for 5 days, and then it dies. Likewise, for the little girl, she dies, but she doesn't just die, she suffers and then dies. Okay, the theist must believe that for each of these evils there is some greater good to which it leads, a good that an all-powerful being simply could not realize without permitting that evil. But is what the theist believes about these two evils really so? Is there really some great good that an omnipotent being, all-powerful being, could not bring about, that an all-powerful being could bring about only by permitting that fawn to be badly burned and to suffer intensely for 5 days before death relieves its torment? And is there really some great good that an all-powerful being could bring about only if he permits that little 5-year-old girl in Flint, Michigan to be savagely beaten, raped, and strangled? And even if it should somehow be so in these two cases, is it true that all the instances of intense human and animal suffering occurring daily in our world lead to greater goods in such a way that even an all-powerful being could not have achieved any of those goods without permitting the instances of suffering that supposedly lead to them? In light of our knowledge of the scale of human and animal suffering occurring daily in our world, the idea that none of those instances of suffering could have been prevented by an all-powerful being without the loss of a greater good must strike us as an extraordinary idea, quite beyond our belief. And if it does strike us in this way, the first premise of the argument we are considering, there exists evils that an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good being would have no good reason to permit, is bound to strike us as plausible, something quite likely to be true. But since the second premise is generally agreed to be true, we should then conclude that it is likely that our conclusion is true, that God does not exist. Okay, my chief concern in this paper is to describe and critically evaluate what seem to me to be the most promising theistic responses to the challenge I've just described. So that is, the responses that someone who believes that an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good being does exist, someone who believes that God exists, their responses to this argument, or the argument that's on page 2.